When you think about a historical execution, uh, you generally expect a certain grim, predictable procedure.
Right, a very localized event.
Yeah, like you picture a physical platform, a hostile crowd, and, the mechanical termination of a human life by the authorities in charge. It's contained.
It's just an earthly matter. A state eliminating a perceived threat, cleaning up the mess, and moving on to the next item of business. That is the standard historical framework.
That's the baseline, yeah.
The state flexes its muscle, the crowd watches the spectacle, and the world keeps spinning just like it did the day before.
Right. But imagine an execution where the moment the final sentence is carried out, the sun just vanishes from the sky in the middle of the day.
Utter darkness.
And the solid earth physically fractures under the feet of the executioners. The massive, impenetrable architecture of the nation's religion violently rips apart from the sky downward.
It stops being a localized execution at that point.
Yeah, that is a cosmic event. Welcome, Reformed Thinking. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the source material concerning what is arguably the most staggering, earth-shattering event in human history.
We are looking directly at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
We are. Specifically, we're analyzing the record in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 45 through 54. And we have two rigorous theological texts guiding our discussion today.
And those texts are the cosmic vindication of the crucified king and the crucified king and the shaking earth.
So what's the mission of this deep dive?
Well, the goal here is to examine the cross not as some, passive tragedy, and certainly not as a sentimental display of divine defeat.
I mean, that's how it's often portrayed.
Right,
Well,
it is, yeah. But our sources argue forcefully that we must view the crucifixion as the active, sovereign accomplishment of penal substitutionary atonement.
that's a massive theological term, but we're going to break it down.
We have to, because these texts challenge the modern, man-centered views of the cross, the views that reduce it to, like, a therapeutic example of love or a moral influence.
Yeah, instead, they present it as a scene of divine judicial execution and, at the same time, an absolute cosmic victory. We are looking at a substitution where a penalty is fully paid.
And we are speaking directly to you, the listener, today.
Yeah, whether you are approaching this biblical text for theological clarity, or maybe you're preparing to teach a class, or, you're just seeking personal conviction.
Today's conversation is designed to unpack the precise historical, linguistic, and doctrinal weight of these 9 specific verses.
We're going to look at the Greek syntax, the historical setting, and the massive theological implications of what happened on Golgotha. But to understand the spiritual gravity of the cross, we really need to set the physical stage first.
You can't skip the history.
No, you can't. The authors of our sources make it clear that we have to look at the geopolitical landscape where this occurred. Setting that historical scene provides the necessary context for the supernatural events that follow.
We can't just jump into the theology without looking at the dirt, the politics, and the blood of first-century Jerusalem.
So let's talk about that setting.
Yeah, the historical setting is critical to everything that unfolds. The events of Matthew 27, they transpire outside the city walls of Jerusalem on this elevated knoll called Golgotha.
And the timeline places us around the spring of AD 30 or maybe 33.
Right, and this is an era characterized by intense, suffocating Roman occupation. Pontius Pilate is the procurator, and he's ruling Judea with an iron fist.
He's a fascinating figure because he's constantly trying to maintain the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, against this steady undercurrent of Jewish messianic rebellion.
Pilate's historical record shows he was brutal, yeah.
Yeah.
But he was also politically vulnerable.
He had to keep the peace, or Rome would remove him.
Precisely. And on the religious side of the equation, you have a thoroughly corrupt temple aristocracy.
The Sadducees and the Pharisees.
Right, the major players here. Now, historically, these two groups despised one another.
They couldn't agree on anything.
Right, they disagreed on theology, they disagreed on politics, and they disagreed on the resurrection of the dead.
But the sources point out that they've actually colluded here. They've formed this unholy alliance to partner with the Roman authorities to execute Jesus of Nazareth.
They bring him to Pilate under dual charges.
Political treason and theological blasphemy.
Right. Treason against Rome, claiming he's setting himself up as a rival king to Caesar, and blasphemy against God.
That collusion sets up a massive covenantal detail that our sources say we simply cannot miss.
And this is where the timeline gets amazing.
This execution occurs during the Passover. The timing is not an accident. The sources argue this is an exact synchronization ordained by God.
During the Passover season, hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims gathered in Jerusalem. The city would just swell to many times its normal population.
And at the very hours Jesus is hanging on the cross, an immense number of Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple courts by the priests.
The blood of these lambs is quite literally flowing out of the Temple Mount.
I've read descriptions of what Passover looked like during that era. It was a massive industrial-scale operation of sacrifice.
The sights, the sounds, the smell of the blood, and the fires.
It would have overwhelmed your senses completely. And our sources stress that this synchronization signals the definitive transition from the typical shadow-filled animal sacrifices of the Old Covenant to the once-for-all reality of the true Lamb of God.
The physical shadows, the rituals that have been repeated for centuries, they're operating at full capacity inside the city walls.
While the eternal substance, the actual payment for sin, is bleeding on the cross just outside those walls.
That spatial contrast is vital. The book of Hebrews talks about Jesus suffering outside the camp.
Right, outside the gate, yeah.
The old system is functioning inside the city, blind to the fact that it is being rendered obsolete by what is happening on Golgotha.
That really sets the stage for the first major supernatural event. Matthew records a detail that shifts the narrative entirely from a human execution to a divine judgment.
He writes that darkness fell over the land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour.
Now, according to the Jewish division of the day, which begins at sunrise around 6 par a.m., the 6th hour corresponds precisely to noon.
And the 9th hour is 3:00 p.m.
This is the period of the day when the sun should be at its absolute peak strength and brightness. The Middle Eastern sun at high noon is relentless.
Yet a sudden 3-hour descent of absolute darkness covers the land.
It's not just a passing cloud cover. It's an overwhelming, unnatural blackness. Now, I've heard people over the years try to explain this away as a natural phenomenon.
Sure, people always try to do that.
A solar eclipse is usually the go-to explanation. But the sources we are looking at address that theory directly, don't they?
They do, and they dismantle the eclipse theory completely using basic astronomy. A solar eclipse is scientifically impossible during a full moon.
And Passover is always a full moon.
Right. The Jewish calendar is lunar, and the Feast of Passover always falls on a full moon. The month of Nisan begins with the new moon, making the 14th day Passover the time of the full moon.
So the lunar phase absolutely precludes a natural eclipse.
The moon is on the wrong side of the Earth to block the sun. It's just geometry. Furthermore, even if the orbital mechanics were different, a total solar eclipse lasts for a matter of minutes.
Not hours.
At the absolute maximum, a solar eclipse might offer about 7.5 minutes of totality in one specific location.
And Matthew is recording 3 continuous hours of darkness.
That is a massive distinction. 3 minutes versus 3 hours.
And the extra-biblical writers of antiquity actually wrestled with this historical anomaly, right?
Correct.
Like, they knew this happened, and they tried to figure out a way to explain it without admitting the supernatural element.
Yes, our sources cite some fascinating historical records on this. The 2nd century Samaritan historian Thallus and the Greek chronicler Phlegon of Tralles both attempted to write off this darkness as a natural solar eclipse.
Secular historians trying to document the unusual events of the era.
Yeah, and their arguments were preserved by later Christian historians like Julius Africanus in the 3rd century.
Right, Africanus, right.
And Africanus pointed out that their own chronological calendars betrayed them. They admitted the darkness happened, but by calling it an eclipse, they proved they were stretching for a naturalistic explanation.
Africanus basically said to them, you know the lunar cycles, you know it was a full moon, so calling it an eclipse is intellectually dishonest.
The darkness was a historical fact that the ancient world had to grapple with.
So if we rule out an eclipse and we establish this as a supernatural event, what is the theological meaning of this darkness? The authors of our sources do not view this as just a spooky atmospheric effect.
No, not at all. They see it as a profoundly specific theological statement. Well, staggering one, I should say.
Right.
In the ancient Near East, and specifically throughout Hebrew literature, darkness signifies the direct judicial arrival of Yahweh.
It is the physical manifestation of divine judgment.
God is light. And when he comes in judgment against sin, he often brings a thick, terrifying darkness.
The most prominent parallel that the sources draw is the 9th plague of darkness over Egypt in Exodus chapter 10.
Oh, yeah. That was a darkness that the text says could be felt. It was a tangible, oppressive blackness that preceded the death of the firstborn.
And there is a specific prophetic warning in the Old Testament that the sources link directly to this moment on the cross.
That would be Amos chapter 8, verse 9. In that passage, God is warning Israel of impending judgment, and he declares, I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day.
The judgment of God is linked to the unnatural failure of the sun at its highest point.
Our sources argue that the darkness at Golgotha is the visible manifestation of God's holy wrath being poured out upon the substitute. It is a localized, concentrated display of hell.
Let me offer an analogy to help visualize what the sources are describing here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you were sitting in a highly publicized, chaotic courtroom trial.
Got it.
The room is bright, cameras are flashing, reporters are shouting, the gallery is packed with hostile onlookers. The judge strikes the gavel and begins to read the final guilty verdict for a capital crime.
Tension is high.
Right. And the very second he pronounces the word guilty, the sun outside vanishes, the power grid fails, and the entire building is plunged into pitch blackness.
Wow.
Not just dim light, but absolute suffocating darkness. The sheer terror in that room would be overwhelming. The shouting would stop.
That's intense.
The physical environment suddenly mirrors the massive gravity of the legal judgment taking place. The darkness forces everyone to realize that this is not just a human procedure anymore.
That captures the atmosphere perfectly. The sources view the cross as a cosmic courtroom. The darkness demonstrates that the Father is executing his holy judicial wrath upon the Lord Jesus Christ as the federal substitute for his elect people.
Christ is actively undergoing the legal curse of the law.
The physical darkness is a shield, in a way, hiding the most intense, intimate transaction of wrath and judgment between the Father and the Son.
God is pouring out the penalty of human rebellion onto the shoulders of the incarnate Word.
And, the sources make a very strong point about how this event challenges the way modern people think about God.
I want to focus on that. How does this cosmic darkness completely shatter the therapeutic views of God's character that are so prevalent today? Because we live in an era where God is often portrayed as a kind cosmic therapist who just wants everyone to be happy and fulfilled.
The authors argue that the darkness at Calvary shatters those modern views by proving that God is a consuming fire who will not compromise his holiness to overlook sin.
Yeah, the modern church landscape often promotes a message that ignores the severe holiness of God.
They present a deity who simply sweeps sin under the rug out of a sense of empathy or mere tolerance.
Just blind tolerance.
But our sources insist that the 3 hours of darkness prove salvation was achieved through the hard, objective reality of penal satisfaction.
Let's unpack that term, penal satisfaction, because it is central to the argument. We are talking about a legal penalty being satisfied.
Correct. God's unmitigated fury against sin had to be exhausted. Justice had to be done. A holy God cannot simply wave a magic wand and pretend sin didn't happen. The wages of sin is death.
And if God didn't spare his own beloved Son when sin was judicially imputed to him, the idea that he will simply excuse the sins of those who reject Christ is presented by these sources as a catastrophic delusion.
The darkness silences every shallow doctrine of God that imagines mercy without the satisfaction of justice.
The cross is where God's infinite mercy and his infinite justice meet, and the result is a terrifying display of wrath.
So we have this intense, visible, yet silent darkness covering the land for 3 hours. The visual spectacle of the cross is hidden.
The mockery of the crowd likely dies down as people are paralyzed by fear in the pitch black.
And then suddenly an agonizing auditory cry pierces through the darkness. The narrative moves from the visual to the auditory. Let's look at verses 46 through 49, focusing on the cry of dereliction and the reaction of the blind bystanders.
Around the 9th hour, which is 3:00 p.m., right at the end of the 3 hours of darkness, Jesus cries out.
Matthew records the Aramaic transliteration of the cry, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which translates to, my God, why have you forsaken me?
This is a direct, intentional citation of Psalm 22, verse 1.
Jesus is pointing the listeners to the messianic psalm that details the exact sufferings of crucifixion centuries before the Romans invented the practice.
The specific Greek terms used here by Matthew are incredibly weighty. The sources spend significant time breaking down the verb Matthew uses for Christ, crying out.
Yeah.
This is not just a casual statement.
No, the verb is anabosin. In the Greek language of the time, this word means to shout aloud, to shriek, or to cry out with intense emotional and physical exertion.
And Matthew adds the qualifying phrase, phon megale, meaning with a loud voice.
Our sources point out the physical reality of crucifixion here. To speak at all on a cross requires the victim to push up on the nailed feet to draw breath, inducing excruciating pain.
A person dying this way eventually suffocates because they no longer have the strength to push up and inflate their lungs.
Therefore, for Jesus to cry out with a massive booming voice after hours of this torture is highly unusual. This is not the weak, fading whisper of a man slowly drifting into unconsciousness.
It's a forceful, agonizing shout that commands attention.
And the word used for forsaken is equally intense, isn't it? The authors dig into the morphology of that specific Greek word to show just how total this abandonment was.
The Greek verb translated as forsaken is ekatelipes. The sources note it is a compound verb built from three parts. En meaning in, kata meaning down, and lipo meaning to leave.
When you put those together, the lexical force of this word is staggering. It means to desert someone entirely to their fate. It means to abandon them completely in a state of extreme distress, leaving them stranded in the most dire circumstance imaginable.
Furthermore, by using the aorist tense in the Greek, Christ is pointing to a completed historic act of judicial desertion by the Father. He is not asking a question out of confusion, he is declaring the reality of what has just occurred in the darkness.
We need to be very precise here to avoid a major theological error. When people hear that the Father abandoned the Son, they sometimes imagine that the Trinity itself was ripped apart.
That's a huge misconception.
The sources are careful to clarify that this is not a rupture in the Trinity. The divine nature of the Son is not separated from the Father. The eternal unity of the Godhead remains intact.
So the question the sources answer is, what is actually happening in this dereliction? How can the Father forsake the Son if they are one God?
That is a crucial distinction, and the sources spend time addressing it to guard against heresy. The eternal communion of the Trinity cannot be broken. God is one, in essence.
What is happening on the cross is that Christ, functioning specifically in his human nature and in his mediatorial office as the federal head of his people, is experiencing real forensic dereliction.
Let's clarify forensic dereliction. We are talking about a legal standing before a judge.
Yes. The Father turned away the favorable light of his presence. He stopped dealing with Jesus as the beloved Son in that moment, and instead treated the incarnate Son as the personification of human sin.
The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:21 that God made him to be sin who knew no sin.
Jesus is enduring the total withdrawal of felt comfort and the active, furious infliction of penal wrath that the sins of his people deserve.
He is absorbing the penalty.
The divine nature upholds the human nature to endure the infinite wrath, but the human consciousness of Jesus feels the absolute crushing weight of divine abandonment. It is the punishment of hell compressed into those hours.
And right beneath this massive cosmic transaction, you have the bystanders. The narrative pans down from the wrath of God to the reaction of the crowd in verses 47 through 49.
They hear Eli, Eli, and they completely misunderstand the Aramaic.
They assume Jesus is calling for the ancient prophet Elijah to come rescue him.
Our sources highlight this as a picture of absolute spiritual blindness. Some of the soldiers or bystanders run and offer him sour wine on a sponge.
This is Pascha, a cheap, acidic vinegar drink commonly consumed by the Roman military.
They put it on a reed and lift it to his lips. The sources suggest this might have been done to clear his throat, to prolong his life just enough to see what happens next.
The crowd cynically says, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." They possess a morbid fascination with the potential spectacle, completely deaf to the theological reality of what is transpiring right in front of them.
This raises a terrifying thought experiment for the listener based on the arguments in our texts. The crowd's reaction illustrates a tremendous danger. How does this scene demonstrate the danger of possessing religious knowledge, like knowing the prophecies about Elijah's role in the end times, while entirely lacking spiritual sight?
The authors argue that familiarity with holy things can actually harden a person's heart if it is not coupled with true faith. These bystanders, and especially the religious leaders among them, knew the scriptures backward and forward.
They knew Psalm 22.
They knew the messianic expectations surrounding the return of Elijah based on the book of Malachi, yet they are watching the definitive fulfillment of all Old Testament scripture happening in real time, and they interpret it as a sideshow.
They want a theatrical rescue.
They want Jesus to come down from the cross, to call down fire or an angelic army. They completely miss the fact that if he did come down from the cross, humanity would be damned forever.
They miss that the substitutionary sacrifice required for their own salvation is happening right before their eyes. The sources argue that religious privilege and intellectual knowledge, without the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit, only result in a deeper condemnation.
Advancing from that agonized cry and the morbid mockery of the crowd, the narrative reaches the actual moment of death. This brings us to verse 50, which the sources frame as the sovereign dismissal of the Spirit.
This moment directly answers the crowd's mockery regarding his supposed helplessness. The crowd thinks he is a victim waiting for a rescue that won't come. The text says otherwise.
Verse 50 records that Jesus cries out again. Matthew writes, Palin craxus phone megal, meaning he cried out again with a loud voice.
We mentioned this earlier, but it is worth repeating because the sources place so much weight on it. This second cry indicates undiminished physical strength right up to the final second.
He is not fading away.
The sources highlight a fascinating linguistic choice by Matthew here regarding how Jesus actually dies. When you read Greek literature from the ancient world, there are standard ways to describe someone passing away.
But Matthew doesn't use the standard Greek verbs for dying. He goes out of his way to phrase it differently.
That's right. Standard Greek verbs like tenesko or teltau imply a natural passing away. They suggest someone succumbing to the elements, losing a battle with disease, or just reaching the end of physical exhaustion.
Matthew deliberately avoids those common words. Instead, he uses the phrase aphiken to pneuma.
So if we break that phrase down, what is Matthew trying to communicate to the reader?
The phrase translates to, he yielded up his spirit, or he dismissed his spirit. The verb aphiken means to send away, to let go, or to release.
It denotes a conscious, voluntary, and authoritative act of the will.
The sources stress that Jesus did not die of physical exhaustion. He was not a helpless victim who finally succumbed to the horrors of Roman execution.
The Romans were experts at killing, but they did not kill Jesus.
He actively and sovereignly dismissed his own soul at the exact moment of his choosing.
The doctrinal weight here is massive. Our sources point out that this directly aligns with the Gospel of John, chapter 10, where Jesus states clearly that no one takes his life from him, but he lays it down of his own accord.
He says he has the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again.
Absolutely. The sources argue that this detail refutes all synergistic or naturalistic theological systems.
Let's touch on synergism for a second. Synergism is the idea that salvation is a cooperative effort, where man contributes his part alongside God's part.
But the cross, as presented in these texts, demonstrates a finished, sovereign, unilateral work of God. Christ's legal work was twofold: his active obedience and his passive obedience.
Let's define those terms for the listener because the sources lean heavily on them. Active and passive obedience.
Okay, so active obedience refers to Christ living a perfect, sinless life. He kept every demand of the law of God perfectly on behalf of his people.
And passive obedience refers to him suffering the penalty of the law on the cross. He absorbed the punishment for the broken law.
The sources argue that when both the active and passive obedience were fully complete, when the wrath was exhausted and the debt was paid in full, he sovereignly shut the door on his own earthly life.
He was both the high priest offering the sacrifice on the altar and the sacrifice itself. When the priestly work was done, he dismissed his spirit.
Think of it like a reigning monarch in a time of war. Instead of being dragged off his throne, beaten, and executed by a hostile, overpowering mob, the king marches into the enemy camp on his own terms.
I like this analogy.
He fights the battle, secures the victory, and then, rather than being killed by the enemy, he steps down, removes his own crown, and hands over his life precisely when his meticulously planned work is finished.
It completely alters the entire perspective of the scene. The sources argue this act of self-donation changes how we should view the crucifixion. It removes the category of tragedy entirely.
That's a very accurate representation of the author's argument. A tragedy involves circumstances overpowering the protagonist. The hero tries his best, but is eventually crushed by forces beyond his control.
But the crucifixion, according to these texts, is the protagonist overpowering the circumstances. When we understand that Christ actively laid down his life as a propitiatory sacrifice, a sacrifice that appeases wrath, we see the cross not as a place of defeat, but as a throne of victory.
He wasn't just attempting to make salvation possible. He secured redemption definitively for his people. He dismissed his spirit because the legal transaction was an absolute success. There was nothing left to pay.
The moment Christ dismissed his spirit, the text says the effects rippled out instantly.
The shockwaves moved from his body on Golgotha into the physical architecture of Israel's religion in the heart of Jerusalem, and then down into the earth itself. This brings us to verse 51, looking at the torn veil and the shaking earth.
Matthew marks this massive transition with the phrase kai idu, which translates as "and behold," or "look at this."
It's a narrative marker directing the reader to a sudden miraculous intervention. Matthew wants you to pay close attention.
He writes that the catapetasma of the temple was violently ripped in two.
The catapetasma is the massive, thick inner veil of the temple, correct? We're not talking about a thin curtain you'd hang in a living room.
No, this is an architectural barrier. Historical sources and traditions describe it as an immensely heavy, thick, intricately embroidered tapestry.
It hung in the temple to separate the holy place from the Holy of Holies.
And the Holy of Holies was the epicenter of God's manifest presence on earth under the Old Covenant. It was a terrifying place.
It was accessible only to the high priest, and he could only enter once a year, on the Day of Atonement, with the blood of a sacrifice, as prescribed in Leviticus 16.
The veil was a constant, visual, imposing reminder that sinners cannot casually stroll into communion with a perfectly holy God. It said, "Keep out, lest you die."
And the direction of the tear is specified meticulously in the Greek text. The sources make a huge point about the physics of this tear.
Matthew writes that it was torn ap anothen hioskato, meaning from top to bottom. Given the immense height of the veil, often estimated to be 60 feet high, no human being could have reached the top to begin tearing it.
Furthermore, the verb used for tearing, schist, is in the passive voice.
A divine passive, as the sources call it.
Precisely. In biblical Greek, the passive voice often implies that the action was performed by an unseen outside force, namely God himself. The direction from top to bottom, far out of human reach, proves that Almighty God himself grabbed the barrier and tore it apart.
God destroyed the separation.
What is the theological meaning of this divine vandalism? Why would God destroy the very barrier he commanded Moses and Solomon to build?
Our sources argue it signifies the total, permanent abrogation of the Levitical priesthood and the entire Old Covenant ceremonial economy.
The book of Hebrews, in chapter 10, explains that the veil represented Christ's flesh. When his flesh was torn on the cross, the true and living way into the holy presence of God was opened.
The shadow, the animal sacrifices, the temple, the earthly priests has reached its appointed fulfillment in the substance, which is Christ.
Access to God is no longer restricted to a single human priest offer repeated animal sacrifices in a building in Jerusalem. It is open to all who are united to Christ by faith, based solely on his finished blood sacrifice.
This application strikes a devastating blow against false mediators today. The sources apply this text directly against modern sacerdotalism. Let's define sacerdotalism for the listener. It's a big theological word, but the concept is very common.
Sacerdotalism is the belief that special human priests are necessary mediators between God and mankind. It's the idea that you cannot access God's grace directly. You have to go through a human priest to administer sacraments.
The authors of our sources argue that the tearing of the veil completely refutes systems like the Roman Catholic Mass. In their view, the Mass attempts to represent the sacrifice of Christ continuously on an altar through a human priest.
The sources argue that to attempt to sew up the veil and reinstate a mediating human priesthood is a direct affront to the finality of Christ's finished work. The way is open. The human priesthood is retired.
The sources also argue that this refutes modern, seeker-sensitive pragmatism in the church, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Pragmatism in the church often tries to manufacture access to God. They try to create spiritual experiences through emotional atmospheres, manipulative music, smoke machines, or relatable therapeutic preaching.
But the torn veil declares that access to God was not purchased by our emotional efforts or our manufactured environments. It was purchased by blood and wrath.
We draw near to God not through our own experiences, but through the objective historical sacrifice of the incarnate Son. The veil was torn by a legal payment, not by a good worship set.
Along with the torn veil, Matthew notes in verse 51 that the earth shook and rocks were split. The Greek verbs assest for shaking and asestizin for splitting indicate a violent seismic event.
Now, I can anticipate a skeptical counterargument here from someone reading this text historically. A skeptic might say, well, an earthquake happened to strike Jerusalem right as Jesus died. The region sits on a fault line. It was a coincidentally timed natural disaster, and the shaking of the earth caused the temple structure to shift, and that structural shift is what ripped the curtain. It wasn't God, it was geology.
How do the sources use the text itself to rule out that naturalistic explanation?
The authors argue that the specific physical direction of the tear absolutely rules out structural damage from an earthquake. Think about the physics of a building shifting during a tremor.
Right, if a building shakes.
If an earthquake damages a building and causes a hanging curtain to tear, the tearing originates from the stress points at the bottom where the building shifts, or it tears randomly at weak points in the middle. It does not neatly tear from the top dead center down to the floor.
Furthermore, the sources point out the narrative sequence in Matthew's grammar. He places the tearing of the veil before the shaking of the earth.
God rent the heavens. He rent the veil, and then the creation itself convulsed in response to the death of its creator.
The earthquake is creation's response to the finished work of redemption, not the mechanical cause of the torn veil.
And that violent shaking of the earth naturally leads to the breaking open of the ultimate physical barrier that haunts all of humanity, the grave. Let's move to verses 52 and 53, looking at the open tombs and what the sources call the eschatological first fruits.
This is one of the most bizarre and fascinating details in the entire gospel narrative. Following the earthquake, Matthew records a stunning detail. The tombs break open and the bodies of many sleeping saints are raised.
The Greek says, "Polisomataton kekoimenon hagian exerson." The bodies of the holy ones who had fallen asleep were raised to life.
This is a remarkable historical claim. The physical geography around Jerusalem included many rock-hewn tombs. The earthquake splits the rocks, exposing the tombs, but then a localized resurrection occurs.
God breathes life back into the corpses of these Old Testament saints.
Crucially, the text notes a delay in their movement. It says they came out of the tombs and went into the holy city, appearing to many, but only after Jesus' resurrection on Sunday.
So their tombs open on Friday afternoon when Jesus dies, but they do not walk into Jerusalem until Sunday morning. Why do the sources insist these saints waited? What is the theological necessity of that delay?
The timing is vital to maintain Christ's status as the definitive first fruits of the resurrection. The sources draw heavily on the Apostle Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul makes it clear that Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
He has to be first.
While their graves were open at the exact moment of his death on Friday, demonstrating that his atoning sacrifice broke the legal lock on the grave, they did not manifest themselves to the public until Christ himself had bodily risen from the dead on Sunday.
Christ must hold the preeminence in all things, especially in conquering death.
What is the larger theological meaning of these open tombs at the moment of Christ's death? What is God communicating by doing this?
The authors argue that these raised saints act as the eschatological first fruits. They are a visible historical guarantee of the final bodily resurrection of all believers at the end of the age.
The sources point out that death's authority is rooted entirely in the law. As Scripture says, the sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law.
Because Christ fully satisfied the penalty of the law on the cross, he shattered the legal jurisdiction that death held over his people. Death had no more legal right to hold them.
This fulfills the incredible prophecy of Hosea 13:14, where God says, "I will ransom them from the grip of the grave. I will redeem them from death."
It is a massive Christological fulfillment. These resurrections are a non-repeatable apostolic sign verifying that the king has successfully plundered the heights of death. The graves opened before Sunday because the victory was entirely secured on Friday.
100%. The old creation shakes and fractures because the last Adam has accomplished redemption. The curse of death that entered the world through the first Adam in the garden meets its decisive, victorious answer in the crucified Messiah on the cross.
The physical world cannot contain the reality of what just happened in the spiritual realm.
The narrative then moves from the shaking of ancient rock tombs to the shaking of a human heart. We pivot from cosmic geological signs to the direct conversion of a pagan soldier.
This brings us to verse 54, the centurion's confession and the ultimate implication of the cross.
The text focuses intensely on the Roman centurion and his execution squad. The sources bring to mind who these men are. A Roman centurion commands a century, roughly 100 men.
These are hardened, brutal soldiers.
Their literal job is to oversee the gruesome machinery of crucifixion. They have seen hundreds of men die, screaming. They are completely desensitized to suffering, blood, and death.
They are not prone to religious superstition or sudden emotional outbursts.
Yet, verse 54 says that when they saw the earthquake and the manner of Christ's death, they were seized with paralyzing fear. The Greek phrase is ephobethizin sphodra. They were terrified out of their minds.
And in that moment of terror, they make a staggering declaration. Truly, this was the Son of God.
Our sources identify this as an astonishing theological moment. The authors argue this confession represents the effectual call of the Holy Spirit. This is not mere pagan superstition.
It's not just a temporary emotional reaction to bad weather and an earthquake.
Look at the specific words. In the Gospel of Matthew, this confession, Son of God, is the central Christological title of the entire book.
Is the confession Peter makes when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?"
It is the very identity that Satan challenged in the wilderness. It is the specific title the religious leaders mocked just hours earlier while Jesus was on the cross.
And now, a pagan Roman soldier, a Gentile with no background in the Hebrew Scriptures, declares it as absolute truth.
The historical irony here is just brilliant. The men whose specific state-sponsored duty was to execute the king of the Jews for treason against Rome are the very first people on earth to officially recognize and confess his true divine identity at the moment of his death.
What do the sources say this teaches us about the nature of God's grace and who is capable of receiving it?
The authors argue it teaches that grace is sovereign, and it acts entirely independent of human merit, pedigree, or religious privilege. It highlights a stunning, humiliating reversal for the establishment.
Think about it. The religious experts of Israel, the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the men who possessed the law, the temple, and the prophets, remain utterly blind to the Messiah bleeding right in front of them.
They are standing in the dark, mocking him. Meanwhile, the pagan executioners, whose hands are literally covered in the blood of the Son of God, are brought to saving faith and public confession.
The sources point out that this directly fulfills the ancient Abrahamic promise that the blessing of salvation would eventually break out and extend to the Gentile nations. It proves that no sinner, no matter how steeped in darkness, no matter how active in their rebellion, is beyond the reach of God's effectual call.
That brings us to our final takeaways, tying the historical and theological weight of this entire discussion directly to the arguments made by our source material regarding a person standing before God.
The central argument from all these texts is the absolute necessity of fleeing the wrath of God through faith in the substitute. The authors insist that the 3 hours of darkness at Calvary prove that God will not overlook sin.
The penalty must be paid.
The texts demand a complete eradication of self-righteous legalism. We cannot offer our own good works to a God whose justice required the death of his own Son.
The sources argue we must rely completely on both the active obedience, his perfect life lived in our place, and the passive obedience, his substitutionary death absorbing the wrath we deserved.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over based on the sheer historical magnitude of the events we have discussed. Consider that Roman centurion for a moment.
If the authors of these texts are right, he stood in absolute, terrifying darkness. He was surrounded by a violently shaking earth.
He was looking at a bloodied, mocked, dead man hanging on a Roman instrument of torture. By all earthly metrics, he was looking at a complete and utter failure.
And yet, the text says his eyes were open to see the sovereign creator of the universe.
Furthermore, consider the priests in the temple. The entire structure of ancient religion was not ended by a slow philosophical debate. It was ended by a physical earthquake and a massive curtain being torn by an unseen hand.
It makes you wonder how the people who had to clean up that temple the next morning made sense of what they were seeing.
The physical reality of the crucifixion forced the ancient world to make a decision. The evidence is laid out in the texts. The veil is torn. The centurion confessed.
The historical record presented by the sources leaves us with a profound reality. The events on Golgotha were not a localized tragedy. They were the cosmic pivot point of all human history.
Thank you for joining Reformed Thinking for this deep dive into the source material. Until next time, consider the weight of the cross and the majesty of the open tomb.